It began in the quiet suburb of Maplewood Glen, a place where lawns were measured, hedges were trimmed, and conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. The community was a neat grid of pastel-colored homes, each one a mirror image of the next. On paper, Maplewood Glen looked like perfection, but beneath the manicured lawns and smiling mailboxes, something was brewing, something that would soon tear the peaceful facade apart. At the heart of this small neighborhood lay a strip of green, an unassuming patch of open land bordered by oaks and daisies. To most, it was just an unused lot, but to a handful of residents, it was sacred ground, the unofficial dog park. Every morning, the laughter of owners and the happy barks of dogs filled the air. It wasn't fancy, not even officially recognized by the Homeowners Association. But for years, no one complained. It was where retirees found friendship, children learned kindness, and lonely people found company in wagging tails. That was until the new HOA president took office. Her name was Marjorie Kent, sharp suits, sharper smile. The kind of woman who believed the neighborhood should look like the cover of a real estate brochure. To her, the dog park was an eyesore. The muddy paw prints near the walkway, the patchy grass, even the laughter, it all offended her sense of order. Within a week of her appointment, she issued her first notice. Unauthorized communal gatherings and off-leash activities are strictly prohibited. The notice landed like a thunderclap. At first, residents thought it was a mistake. The dog park wasn't official, but it had existed for nearly a decade without issue. Yet as more letters arrived, the message was clear: Marjorie intended to shut it down. Soon, HOA inspectors began showing up. They took photos, measured fence lines, cited supposed property violations. Even dogs being walked nearby drew warning stares. The once joyful patch of green grew quiet. Leashes were shortened and laughter turned to whispers. But not everyone was ready to surrender. Among the residents was a woman named Claire Whitmore, a schoolteacher and lifelong dog lover. Her golden retriever Daisy had grown up running through that field. Claire had watched shy neighbors blossom there, watched friendships bloom over games of fetch. The park wasn't just grass, it was community, and she wasn't about to let it vanish without a fight. She began collecting stories, photos of dogs who'd played there for years, testimonials from elderly residents who said the park gave them purpose. Slowly, she built a quiet resistance. Her living room became a war room: maps, HOA bylaws, printouts of property deeds. Every evening, people gathered around her dining table, voices hushed but determined. The HOA's rules were strict but not perfect. Hidden within the dense legal jargon of the community charter were loopholes, vague definitions of common areas, and undeveloped parcels. Claire realized that the park technically wasn't under the HOA's full jurisdiction. It was community-owned land, left over from the original builder's plans. The HOA could control appearances, not existence. But before Claire could make her case, Marjorie struck again. Within 2 weeks, bright orange signs were staked into the ground. No trespassing, HOA enforcement in effect. And then one morning, residents woke to the sound of heavy machinery. A landscaping crew hired by the HOA was tearing through the grass. The swing set was dismantled, the benches hauled away, and the little wooden "Welcome to Maplewood Dog Park" sign was crushed beneath a truck tire. By sundown, the place looked barren, stripped of its soul. Tears filled the eyes of the dog owners who gathered along the fence that evening. But amid the heartbreak, something fierce took root. The destruction didn't kill their spirit, it ignited it. Claire stood there, silent but burning inside. Around her were dozens of neighbors, some holding leashes, others holding hands. And as she looked over the wreckage, one thought crystallized in her mind: they think they've won, but she knew better. Because Maplewood Glen had always been a community built by its people, not its paperwork, and she was about to remind the HOA exactly what that meant. The next morning, a single sign appeared on the bare field, hand-painted, slightly crooked but bold: "This park belongs to the people." No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew who had done it. And soon, photos of the sign spread through local Facebook groups and neighborhood chats. The post went viral, comments flooded in from nearby communities, offering support, legal advice, even donations. Marjorie dismissed it as noise. She underestimated the residents, and that would be her first mistake. Because what started as a few frustrated dog owners was about to become something much bigger. The battle for Maplewood Glen's dog park was no longer about rules or grass. It was about power and the people who refused to bow to it. The HOA had declared war. But the residents had just begun to fight back. And as the sun set that evening over the silent park, Claire watched the orange glow fade behind the oaks and whispered to herself, not as a promise but as a warning: you can't leash freedom forever. The winds shifted that night. The battle lines were drawn. And by morning, Maplewood Glen would never be the same again. By dawn, Maplewood Glen hummed with quiet rebellion. The HOA might have believed it had crushed the residents' spirit, but the truth was it had only scattered the embers that were now catching fire. Claire sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by coffee cups, documents, and printouts. Daisy, her golden retriever, slept by her feet, unaware of the storm her owner was preparing to unleash. Claire wasn't a lawyer, but she had something just as powerful: purpose. And purpose, she knew, could move mountains. The destruction of the dog park had hit everyone differently. For some it was grief, for others outrage, but for Claire it was transformation. She began drafting what would soon become the spark of a community uprising: a formal open letter to the HOA, written in calm, professional tones but pulsing with quiet defiance. It began with a single line: "This is not just about a park, it's about the right to belong." The letter laid out everything: the history of the dog park, its role in fostering community, the emotional and social impact it had on the residents. It cited sections of the HOA's own charter, the vague clauses about common land usage, and the lack of any formal vote to remove communal features. It wasn't angry, it was ironclad. Claire titled it simply, "The Maplewood Petition." By mid-morning, she'd shared it with her closest neighbors. By noon, it had spread through every inbox in Maplewood Glen. And by nightfall, it had reached far beyond local Facebook groups, pet rescue pages, even a few small news outlets that thrived on neighborhood drama. People began to sign. At first, a few dozen names, then hundreds, residents from surrounding communities, even some former HOA board members added their support. The letter didn't just speak for the residents of Maplewood Glen. It spoke for anyone who'd ever felt powerless under rules that valued perfection over people. Marjorie, of course, was furious. She called an emergency HOA meeting that week. The tone was sharp, the agenda short: unauthorized petitioning and defamation of HOA leadership. Notices were sent out threatening fines for community disruption. But by then the movement had already taken root, and fear no longer had power. Neighbors who'd once avoided conflict began to act. Retirees who never touched social media now filmed video testimonials about the park. Teenagers who'd played fetch with their dogs started designing protest signs. Parents spoke about how the park had taught their children compassion. And Claire, once just a quiet teacher, became the voice of them all. She didn't seek attention. But when a local reporter showed up, microphone in hand, asking for a statement, she didn't shy away. Standing before the empty park, she spoke with steady conviction. She talked about community empathy and what it meant when people came together against blind authority. The video aired that evening, short, simple, heartfelt. Within 24 hours, it had over 50,000 views. Suddenly, Maplewood Glen wasn't just another suburban neighborhood. It was the center of a growing story, one that questioned the reach of homeowners, associations, and the meaning of belonging in a perfect community. As media attention grew, the HOA began to fracture internally. A few board members quietly contacted Claire expressing sympathy. They joined the board to help neighbors, not control them. Marjorie dismissed them as weak, but even she could feel control slipping through her fingers. The HOA tried to fight back with its own letter, a cold, bureaucratic statement about safety hazards and property standards. But it rang hollow. No one bought the narrative anymore. The residents had seen the truth. This wasn't about safety or order, it was about power. The next week, Claire organized something no one expected: a walk for the park. It wasn't a protest, not officially. Just a group of neighbors walking their dogs through the heart of Maplewood Glen, silent, respectful, united. When the day came, the turnout was staggering. Over 200 people marched, some holding leashes, others carrying signs, a few even bringing folding chairs to sit along the path. Children held up posters drawn in crayon: "Save our park, let the dogs play, we are Maplewood." Drones filmed overhead, cars slowed to watch. Even the local news returned to capture the sight of an entire neighborhood moving as one. Marjorie watched from behind her curtained window, her jaw set tight. The board had warned her that pushing too far could backfire. But she couldn't back down now, not after making it personal. That evening she called an emergency landscaping order, the final step in her plan. If she couldn't stop the people, she'd eliminate the park for good. The next morning, a team would arrive with concrete mixers. Her plan was to pave over the park completely and rezone it as a maintenance lot. But as fate would have it, someone overheard. A worker at the landscaping company, a local father who walked his dog there every evening, quietly texted Claire the news. She read the message in disbelief. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m., they're pouring concrete." For a moment, fear flickered in her chest, then something else took its place: resolve. She called her neighbors. One by one, phones lit up across Maplewood Glen. Messages spread through group chats, Facebook pages, and text chains. No one slept much that night. By sunrise, before the trucks could arrive, the residents gathered once more, this time not in protest but in protection. They stood shoulder to shoulder along the park's border, dogs sitting calmly beside them as the first construction vehicle rumbled down the street. The workers stopped. They didn't want conflict. The driver stepped out, uncertain. The crowd was silent, but their silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Then Claire stepped forward. She handed the foreman a printed copy of the petition, now with thousands of signatures. She didn't say a word, she didn't need to. The man looked at the papers, then at the people, and slowly he shook his head. The truck reversed. One by one the others followed. The park was safe for now. That night, as the sun dipped low and the dogs once again ran free across the grass, Claire stood quietly by the fence. She knew this victory was only temporary. Marjorie wouldn't stop, but neither would they, because Maplewood Glen had found something far stronger than any rulebook: unity. And soon that unity would turn into strategy, a plan that would take the fight straight into the heart of the HOA itself. For weeks, the air in Maplewood Glen pulsed with unease. The HOA had gone quiet, too quiet, and everyone knew what that meant. Marjorie wasn't done, she was regrouping. The residents carried on their daily lives, pretending everything was normal. The dogs ran again, the grass began to heal, and laughter cautiously returned. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Every rustle of paper from the HOA office felt like a threat waiting to be delivered. Claire, meanwhile, was working in the shadows. She had realized that their victory in the park was only the beginning, a battle won, not the war. To truly protect the park, they needed something more powerful than signatures and sympathy. They needed the law. Her nights grew longer. She spent hours poring over HOA documents, minutes from old meetings, and scanned copies of the original neighborhood development plans she'd managed to obtain from the county archives. The files were dense, page after page of clauses, subclauses, and cryptic amendments written in dry legalese. But one night, somewhere between exhaustion and obsession, Claire found it. Buried deep within a 30-year-old land use file, she noticed a reference to parcel. The term meant nothing to her at first, but when she cross-referenced it with a map, her heart began to race. Parcel 9C was the park. And next to it, in faded type, were the words, "To remain a designated public green space in perpetuity for communal recreation." Her eyes widened. In perpetuity, that meant forever. The developer had legally locked that land as public use. The HOA had no right to alter it, pave it, or claim it as their own. Claire's hands trembled as she printed the page. After all the intimidation, all the letters and threats, the truth had been sitting there all along, waiting for someone to look close enough. The next morning, she gathered her small circle of allies. Ethan, a retired city planner; Mrs. Lopez, a former HOA secretary who'd quietly left years ago; and Janine, a lawyer who lived 2 streets over and had been following the story from the start. They studied the document line by line, verifying signatures, comparing it to zoning records, checking dates. Everything matched. The park wasn't just a sentimental landmark, it was legally protected land. This, Janine said, tapping the clause, is their worst nightmare. The residents now held a weapon far more powerful than protest, proof. But Claire knew the truth alone wasn't enough. They needed to time their move perfectly. Marjorie would deny it, of course. She'd bury them in bureaucracy, call it a misinterpretation, claim it was outdated. Claire needed to make sure the entire community saw the truth at once in a way the HOA couldn't hide or twist, so she waited. A few days later, the HOA announced a mandatory town review meeting, supposedly to discuss neighborhood safety and maintenance budgets. But everyone knew what it was really about: Marjorie's attempt to regain control. Attendance was required and every household would be there. That was the moment Claire had been waiting for. The evening of the meeting arrived, heavy with anticipation. The community hall buzzed with whispers. The room was lined with chairs, HOA board members sitting stiffly at the front table, Marjorie in the center, her signature red folder laid neatly before her. She began her speech with her usual practice poise, polished words about community standards, protecting property values, and ensuring safety. The crowd listened in cold silence, and then Claire stood up. Her voice was calm but steady, carrying through the room like a blade cutting through fog. She didn't argue, didn't accuse. She simply held up a folder of her own, a printed copy of the original deed documents, the parcel maps, and the clause itself. She handed it to a nearby resident who read it aloud, line by line. As the words "public green space in perpetuity" echoed through the hall, a hush fell over the room. Heads turned toward Marjorie. Her expression didn't break, but her fingers clenched tighter around her folder. The residents murmured. Some gasped, others began to clap. Claire spoke again, this time addressing everyone. The HOA has no right to destroy what was never theirs. This park was meant for the people of Maplewood Glen, and it always will be. The applause grew louder. Even those who'd once stayed neutral now joined in. For the first time, Marjorie looked cornered. She tried to recover, insisting the document was old, outdated, irrelevant. But Janine, the lawyer, rose and corrected her. The clause had been renewed automatically under state land law. It was fully binding. There was nothing Marjorie could say. The HOA's authority over the park crumbled in real time. By the end of the meeting, the crowd had made their decision. A vote was called, not on the park but on trust. A motion to investigate the HOA board for misconduct passed overwhelmingly. Several members resigned on the spot. Marjorie left the room without a word, but the story didn't end there. The following week, letters began appearing in residents' mailboxes again, this time from Marjorie's personal lawyer. Threats of defamation suits, accusations of illegal interference. It was a last-ditch effort to intimidate, but it didn't work. The residents were no longer afraid. They'd seen behind the curtain. They'd learned that the HOA's power was only as strong as the silence of its people. Soon, journalists picked up the new development. Small suburb outsmarts HOA with decades-old clause, read one headline. Donations poured in to fund a community legal defense just in case. Claire didn't seek recognition. She just wanted peace for her neighbors, for the dogs, for the park. Yet deep down, she knew Marjorie wasn't done. People like her didn't surrender, they schemed. And one night, as the crickets sang and the park glowed softly under the streetlights, Claire noticed a dark SUV parked across from her home. No lights. No movement, just watching. The war wasn't over, it was changing. Because when people in power lose control, they don't fade quietly, they strike from the shadows. And soon Maplewood Glen would learn that the HOA wasn't just fighting for rules anymore. It was fighting for revenge. For a brief, fragile moment, Maplewood Glen exhaled. The residents had faced the HOA and won, or so they believed. The park had been declared untouchable, a permanent sanctuary under the perpetuity clause. The community cheered, dogs ran free again, and Claire, for the first time in months, slept without fear. But victories in Maplewood Glen were never permanent, and Marjorie Kent was not the type to accept defeat quietly. The The retaliation began subtly, almost invisibly, a creeping frost settling over the neighborhood. It started with late-night emails from the HOA, coldly worded compliance notices, tiny infractions magnified into major violations. A forgotten trash bin left out overnight, a garden gnome deemed aesthetic disruption. Even Christmas lights were suddenly out of code. The first to receive one of these letters was Mrs. Lopez. Her hydrangeas, the pride of her front yard, were apparently encroaching beyond HOA-approved perimeter limits. She was fined $150. The next day, Ethan got one too. His mailbox, which hadn't changed in 20 years, was suddenly non-compliant with current design standards. Within a week, nearly every resident who had supported the dog park found an envelope taped to their door. Claire's arrived on a Sunday morning. Her violation was absurd: unauthorized placement of signage on public land. The sign in question, the wooden "This Park Belongs to the People" board, the same one that had become a symbol of unity. The HOA ordered her to remove it immediately or face legal action. But Claire didn't bend. She refused to touch it. Marjorie escalated. Soon, strange things began happening around the neighborhood. A few residents found their cars mysteriously keyed. Others discovered their mail misplaced. One morning, Claire woke to find her trash cans overturned, the contents strewn across her lawn. At first, she thought it was kids, but when she checked her security camera, the feed had been cut cleanly. At 3 a.m. someone was sending a message. It became clear that Marjorie had allies, people still loyal to her, hidden among the residents, carrying out her quiet campaign of intimidation. Anonymous posts began appearing on local message boards accusing Claire of faking the deed documents and manipulating the community. A few residents, scared of fines and conflict, started to pull away. Fear returned to Maplewood Glen, cold and slow like fog seeping through every crack. But Claire didn't retreat. She knew that if she let fear dictate her next move, everything they'd built would crumble. Instead, she documented everything: the fines, the vandalism, the harassment. She built a case of her own. Then she did something Marjorie didn't expect. She went public. She reached out to the same local reporter who'd covered their story before. This time she had photos, letters, timestamps, hard evidence that the HOA was retaliating against its own residents. The story aired under the title, "From Rules to Revenge: Inside Maplewood Glen's HOA War." The report spread fast. Local media picked it up, then regional outlets. Within days, the story went national. Talk shows debated it, calling it a symbol of the growing conflict between HOA authority and homeowner rights. Maplewood Glen was no longer just a neighborhood, it was a headline. Marjorie's fury was volcanic. She called an emergency meeting, desperate to control the narrative. But when she tried to address the residents, the room was half empty and the half that remained glared back in silence. Her authority, once absolute, now hung by a thread. Still, she refused to step down. Instead, she turned to the courts. One afternoon, a knock came at Claire's door. A man in a gray suit handed her a thick envelope: Kent versus Whitmore civil defamation complaint. Marjorie was suing her personally, demanding damages for reputational harm. Claire felt her stomach drop. It was a strategic move, not about money, but exhaustion. Marjorie wanted to bleed her dry through legal fees to drain her will, but the community didn't abandon her. Ethan, the retired planner, offered to help with records. Janine, the lawyer, agreed to represent her pro bono. Donations from across the country poured in after the news report, people sending small amounts, letters of support, even legal advice. And as the lawsuit dragged on, something unexpected happened. State regulators took notice. Investigators began to dig into the HOA's finances, prompted by anonymous tips, though everyone suspected it was Mrs. Lopez who made the call. What they found shocked the entire community. Years of financial irregularities, misreported maintenance fees, unauthorized spending, even evidence that Marjorie had used HOA funds to pay for administrative retreats that never took place. The walls around her perfect little kingdom began to crack. When the news broke, residents gathered in the park not to celebrate but to watch it unfold. It was a strange feeling, a mix of vindication and disbelief. For years, Marjorie had held power over every flowerbed, every paint color, every blade of grass. And now she was the one being audited, investigated, and questioned. But power never dies quietly. The night after the investigation was announced, Claire heard a noise outside her house, a faint scrape, then a dull thud. She stepped onto her porch, heart pounding, and froze. The wooden "This Park Belongs to the People" sign lay shattered in her driveway, splintered into pieces. And spray painted on her fence were two words, dripping red: "Enough already." For the first time, she felt fear, real bone-deep fear. But when dawn came, she didn't call the police first, she called her neighbors. Within an hour, dozens of them were outside her house. They cleaned the fence, gathered the pieces of the sign, and helped her rebuild it stronger, brighter, taller. By sunset, the sign stood again, gleaming in the orange light. This time they added a new line beneath it, hand-painted by a child from the block: "We don't break, we rebuild." And as the last brushstroke dried, the wind carried a faint sound from across the park: sirens. Police cruisers rolled up the main street toward the HOA office. The state had finished its audit. Warrants were being served. Marjorie's empire was collapsing. The retaliation had backfired, but even as her power burned away, something darker loomed behind her, because power never works alone. There were others who had benefited from the HOA's control, others who didn't want the park or the people to win. And while the neighborhood celebrated, a quiet phone call was made, one that would drag the fight into territory far beyond Maplewood Glen. The fall of Marjorie Kent should have ended everything. The HOA president was publicly disgraced, under investigation, and soon to be removed from office. Residents of Maplewood Glen breathed again, believing that at last, justice had been served. But power, as Claire would soon learn, rarely dies, it simply changes hands. After the audit, a temporary management company was appointed to oversee HOA operations until a new board could be elected. The company's name was Silver Rock Property Management, LLC. Their letters were slick, printed on heavy paper with silver embossing, and their tone was professional, disturbingly professional. At first, the residents welcomed the change. The new management promised transparency, accountability, and modernization. They spoke of restoring order and ensuring community integrity. It sounded like healing. It sounded like progress, but within weeks the tone shifted. The emails from Silver Rock were cold, impersonal, and relentless. New maintenance fees appeared on monthly statements justified as temporary restructuring costs. HOA records were sealed under confidential transition review. And most ominously, a clause appeared in the new proposed community charter, a clause that no one had seen before. It read, Parcel 9C designated as communal green space shall be subject to administrative reassessment for potential redevelopment in accordance with regional improvement standards. Claire froze when she read it. Parcel, the dog park. The clause was hidden deep in the draft, buried under language about green initiatives and sustainability upgrades. But she saw it for what it was, a legal trap. If approved, it would strip the park of its protected status and reclassify it as redevelopment potential. Silver Rock wasn't a savior, it was a front. Claire began digging. She traced the company's registration records and discovered it wasn't local at all. It was part of a vast corporate network of property management firms scattered across the country, owned by a single parent entity, Glenville Development Group. Glenville specialized in acquiring community HOAs, consolidating them, and quietly redeveloping unused land into profitable residential expansions. The so-called management transition wasn't cleanup, it was takeover. And the park, their park, was sitting on prime real estate. The more she read, the clearer the pattern became. In other neighborhoods, Glenville had done the same, used temporary management to rewrite bylaws, then slowly converted communal spaces into high-end rental properties or microdevelopments. Residents who resisted were buried in legal fees or forced out. This wasn't about dogs or grass anymore. It was about millions of dollars. Claire felt sick. She gathered her team again, Ethan, Mrs. Lopez, Janine, and laid everything out on her dining table. The filings, the proposed clauses, the property links. Janine's face hardened as she pieced it together. They're trying to privatize the neighborhood, she said quietly. The HOA was just their pawn. They didn't have much time. The community vote on the new charter was scheduled in less than 2 weeks. If Silver Rock won, the park would be reclassified and the clause would become law. The residents had to see the truth, all of it. That night, Claire wrote her most important letter yet, the corporate invasion of Maplewood Glen. It wasn't emotional this time, it was evidence, hard, cold, undeniable. She linked the management company to Glenville's parent firm, listed the other neighborhoods they had gutted, and showed screenshots of the redevelopment plans Silver Rock had quietly filed with the county under preliminary land use studies. Then she sent it everywhere. To residents, to local reporters, to city officials. By morning, the story had spread like wildfire. The headline on the local news read, Corporate Developer Targets Maplewood Glen's Beloved Dog Park. The effect was immediate. Silver Rock's offices were flooded with calls and emails. Protesters gathered outside their local branch. Social media exploded with outrage, but the company didn't back down. Instead, they doubled down, releasing a polished video statement filled with smiling executives and soft piano music. They called their plans a community improvement initiative, claiming they wanted to add modern amenities and increase neighborhood value. To the untrained eye, it sounded harmless, even beneficial, but Claire knew the truth. Amenities meant paving over the park. Value meant pushing out residents who couldn't afford rising fees. The pressure mounted as the vote approached. Silver Rock's representatives began knocking on doors, handing out glossy flyers filled with promises, upgraded sidewalks, security cameras, community gardens. To residents weary of years of HOA drama, it was tempting. Claire fought back with everything she had. She held community meetings, showed photos of Glenville's other neighborhoods, the empty lots, the bulldozed playgrounds, the corporate signs. She spoke with conviction, reminding them that their neighborhood wasn't an investment portfolio, it was a home. But on the night before the vote, she received a message that chilled her to the core. An anonymous email. No subject line, no signature, just 2 sentences. You're playing with powerful people, stop before it's too late. Attached was a single photo of the park, shot from above with surveyor flags already staked in the ground. She rushed outside. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, she saw them, tiny orange flags lining the grass in perfect grid formation, the first step of construction marking. They weren't waiting for the vote, they were already moving forward. By morning, she gathered the community at the park. The sight of the flags sent shockwaves through the crowd. Parents clutched their children, neighbors shouted, the dogs barked nervously as the tension rose. This is illegal, Janine said, her voice trembling with anger. The vote hasn't even happened yet. but deep down they all knew what this meant. Silver Rock wasn't planning to play fair. Later that night, Claire stared out her window watching the park illuminated by the moon. She felt the weight of it, the years of laughter, of belonging, of peace that this ground had given them. And now that peace was about to be sold, bulldozed, and erased. But she also knew something else. Maplewood Glen wasn't the same neighborhood it used to be. The residents had already faced one tyrant and won. This time they would face an empire, and they wouldn't do it quietly. The next morning, Claire made her decision. She opened her laptop, started a live stream, and spoke directly to anyone who would listen. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. She told the world about the flags, the deception, the corporation hiding behind bureaucracy. The video spread faster than anything she'd ever done. Tens of thousands watched, then hundreds of thousands. Petitions appeared, donations flooded in from all over the country. Lawyers, activists, even city council members reached out. The movement that had begun as a fight for a small patch of grass had become something far bigger, a fight against corporate greed itself. But the war was far from over. As the sun rose the following morning, trucks began to roll into Maplewood Glen, large, black, unmarked. And on the side of one of them, barely visible under the grime, were the faint words, Glenville Construction Division. The showdown was about to begin. The morning of the final showdown arrived with an eerie calm that felt almost unnatural. The sun rose behind the dog park, slicing through the mist like a blade, casting long golden streaks across the freshly trimmed grass. It was quiet, too quiet for a neighborhood that had been pulsing with chaos and conflict for months. But that silence wasn't weakness. It was focus, it was unity, it was the deep breath before the strike. For months, the community had lived in tension. The HOA's board, led by Geraldine Sharp, had done everything in their power to crush the resistance. They had issued fines, mailed cease and desist letters, and even tried to hire private security to keep residents off the park grounds. But every attempt had been met with something stronger: the people's will. The residents had transformed from neighbors into something else, a force, a movement. They called themselves the Paws of Liberty. What began as a few frustrated dog owners had become a full-fledged grassroots campaign. They had media coverage now, local news vans parked along the street, drones capturing every moment from above. Even the mayor had been briefed. That morning the HOA planned to hold their final enforcement, the removal of the last fence section surrounding the dog park. It was their way of reclaiming control, of reminding the residents that power still rested in the hands of the board. But what they didn't know was that the community had a plan of their own. As the first HOA truck arrived, the sound of barking echoed through the neighborhood. Dozens of dogs, leashed and ready, stood with their owners at the park's edge. The residents had gathered in silence, forming a living barrier around the park. Some held signs, others carried cameras, but all stood firm. Then the gate creaked open. Geraldine Sharp, flanked by two hired contractors, stepped forward with her clipboard and her usual air of self-importance. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. She simply pointed to the fence and gave a nod. The contractors lifted their tools, and then something extraordinary happened. Before they could make the first cut, every resident stepped forward. One by one they unhooked their leashes. Dogs of every size and breed bolted into the park, running, jumping, barking in joyous defiance. The grass filled with motion, the air with laughter and cheering. The once silent neighborhood was alive again. The contractors froze, the board members froze, the cameras rolled. The people moved. It was chaos, but it was beautiful. Geraldine's face twisted with rage as she screamed orders that no one obeyed. The residents weren't fighting anymore. They were celebrating. They had already won in spirit. And that's when the mayor's car appeared. The sleek black vehicle stopped beside the park. The door opened and Mayor Tom Keene stepped out, flanked by city officials and a cameraman from Channel 7 News. He had been watching the situation unfold online for weeks. The petitions, the protests, the viral videos. The HOA had become a local embarrassment, a cautionary tale of power gone too far. The mayor walked straight to the fence and raised his voice. He didn't need a megaphone. The crowd went silent instantly. What he said next changed everything. He announced that the city had officially acquired the land the HOA had claimed as their own. After reviewing the legal filings, it turned out the HOA's claim to the dog park wasn't as ironclad as they'd made it seem. The land deed was outdated, the boundaries misdrawn. In short, the HOA never had true ownership in the first place. The dog park was and always had been public land. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then came the cheers, the kind that shook the air and echoed off every wall. Dogs barked in harmony, tails wagging like flags of victory. Geraldine dropped her clipboard. Her face went pale. Her power evaporated in an instant, replaced by the cold realization that she'd not only lost control, she'd exposed her entire board to public ridicule. Within hours, resignations began pouring in. The HOA, once feared, now faced legal scrutiny for their overreach and misuse of community funds. By nightfall, the news spread far beyond the neighborhood. The story of the unofficial HOA dog park showdown had gone viral. Headlines across the internet captured the moment. Residents defeat HOA in dog park battle. The bark heard around the block, justice for the paws. The next day the residents gathered again, not to protest but to rebuild. Together they repainted the park's benches, repaired the playground, and hung a new sign at the entrance. The sign read, "Welcome to Liberty Park, a place for paws and people." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Built by the community, protected by the people." Weeks passed and life returned to normal, but nothing was truly the same. The residents had discovered something powerful that when united they could face anything, even an institution built on fear and control. They didn't just win a dog park, they won their freedom. Every evening as the sun dipped low and the dogs ran free across the grass, the people would smile, remembering the months of struggle. The fences had fallen, but in their place stood something stronger: solidarity. And as for Geraldine Sharp, her house sold quietly a month later. She left without a word, her legacy nothing but a cautionary tale whispered among future HOA boards. But her name would forever live online, immortalized in viral videos and dramatic narrations about the HOA that tried to cage joy and failed spectacularly. As the camera fades out on the final scene, dogs running through golden sunlight, laughter in the air, a single line appears across the screen: even the smallest paws can make the biggest stand. And that was the end of the showdown, but for the people of Liberty Park, it was just the beginning. End of story.